I was born June 20th, 1936, in the township of Harris, Minnesota, on a farm that would have been called a subsistence farm then, and it wouldn't even be that now. It was a total of 180 acres on two plots, one of 120 acres and another 40-acre plot. All had been bought by my grandfather over the years.
Were you born at home?
I was born at home, yes. There was the Rush City Hospital, the nearest hospital, was being built the year I was born, but they just had the framing in, they didn't have the rest of it done. But even if the hospital had been built, I'm pretty sure I would have been born at home. They did call out the doctor who came and took a look at me and said, yeah, he's a keeper.
Did you have siblings?
I did. An older brother, Myron, also known as Mike, who's about 4.5 years older than me. So we never had any sibling rivalry because he was enough older that I never got into any arguments with him.
What was life like on the farm when you were young? Or
Well, it was hard. The winters were long. There was a lot of snow. And the summers were hot and humid, and there was always work to do. It was a dairy farm, so we had about 20 cows and 4 horses. We used horses to farm the land. This was before the primitivist movement. This was a recidivist primitivist from the olden days. My father did not believe in capital investment of any kind. So he inherited the farm from my grandfather, so he didn't have to pay a mortgage. And we had the horses and we had machinery that had been bought over the years, farm or horse-drawn machinery. We did not have indoor plumbing. We heated by wood. We had no electricity until some prosperous times right after the end of World War II. Around 1948, for some reason I was never told, we suddenly got a small tractor and electricity and a milking machine. We did not get indoor plumbing.
what kind of work did you do on the farm?
Starting fairly young, I did everything I could to avoid work, but it was unavoidable. Started out cleaning barns, cleaning the horse barn twice a day and the cow barn twice a day, milking, of course, and because I had to go to school, I missed out on a lot of the winter work, which is some of the worst. But I did get to enjoy the summer work, like harvesting hay, where people pitch hay up from haycocks onto a rack, and the youngest person, namely me, had to tramp the hay down and move it around so that it didn't get overbalanced on the rack. This results in a lot of hayseed down your neck, which itches something terrible. And once the haying season was over, the oat harvesting season started, where you had to shock oats, which meant you not only had itchy stuff down your neck, but you got a rash on your arms from holding putting the grain shocks together, grain bundles together into into grain shocks. It was long work. Fortunately, the sun was up for a long time during the summer, so you didn't have to work after dark much. But in the winter time, on the weekends when we weren't in school, we had to cut wood in the woods. There was a wood lot at one end of the farm, and take the horses with a sled, a big sled, and cut down trees, split them with hammer and chisels and sledgehammer and chisels, and then load them onto the sled, bring them home, and pile them up, waiting for a spring and somebody with a saw rig to come along and saw them up into stovewood-sized chunks. Now the wood that we were burning in the stoves had come from the year before, because you have to let them sit for a year to dry. The house itself had been built by Swedish immigrant carpenters who were itinerant types who would go from one farm to another building houses. And they were a very pernickety bunch, as evidenced by the fact that the house was extremely well built, but also square, and it stayed square. We put up sheetrock in the 1970s and as part of remodeling, and we didn't have to trim the sheetrock out of square at all when putting it on the ceiling. There was 4 rooms on the ground floor, a kitchen, large kitchen, a dining room, a living room or parlor, which was often closed off when you didn't have company, because it was just a waste of heat in an uninsulated house. And then a bedroom. And upstairs were 3 bedrooms, pardon me, and they would be heated through a heat register from the heater stove in the dining room down below. You'd open up this register and it would give a puny amount of heat. We also had a round oak stove that would throw some wood in towards bedtime and light a fire in it, and that was upstairs, and it would heat up the room enough so you'd get your clothes off and get under the covers.
What time were you generally up in the morning?
Around 6 o'clock. We didn't get up as early as some of my relatives. We'd that was give us time to milk the cows and have breakfast and change clothes before the school bus, that was when I was in high school, came at about 7:30 or so. Before, for the first 8 grades, I walked to school, because a quarter mile away was a one-room schoolhouse, which still exists in a new life in the town of Harris as the Legion Hall. But back then it had a bell in its belfry, and it was, there were room for about 30 students or so for the 8 grades. There were four students in my class. It was first through 8th only. There was none of this kindergarten nonsense.
And how many teachers did you have?
We had one teacher. You only need one teacher for a one-room school. But as I've said before, you get a fabulous education because you hear everything 8 times, and if you haven't learned it, by the time you're in 8th grade, you're in pretty sad shape.
What were some of your early hobbies or talents?
Talents were basically non-existent. My earliest non-talent was the inability to do arithmetic without counting on my fingers, and I still have that inability. I can't add or subtract without, like 12 minus 8 is 9, 10, 11, 12, 4. I think that's right. So that was a non-talent, and drawing was certainly a non-talent. Penmanship was a non-talent. I loved to sing to myself because my mother sang to herself, and my theory is that I heard all this while in utero, and that's where I got into the habit of singing to myself. So I can carry a tune while singing. I took some piano lessons from the grade school teacher who who lived in town and had to wait for the school bus to come to pick her up. So she gave free piano lessons after class. I loved to have piano lessons because that means I didn't have to rush home and do work. But I was no good at the piano, and it took me about 2 years to get through the preliminary book. Didn't even get to the first book, where I think the one I managed to get through was Teaching Little Fingers to Play. But I'm not very good at piano. But I do love to listen to music, and I did play the wind-up Victrola a lot. I would say that was a talent of mine, was playing the Victrola. Other talents included evading work as much as I could, but that wasn't very successful because there was nowhere to go to evade work other than to run away from home, and I enjoyed eating too much.
I know that you got interested in all things electrical. When did that start?
That started in high school. A cousin of mine named Claire Robinson had his father owned the hardware store in town, so he was wealthy by comparison, and he had some electronic equipment, radio equipment stuff. He was interested in it, so I became interested in it, and I started building homemade radios and getting books. Once I started high school, my mother gave me some money every month to spend on clothing or whatever I wanted to, which was a fabulous thing. I mean, it was an allowance basically, and it meant I could buy books if I wanted to, or I could buy candy if I wanted to, or whatever. And there was none of this, well, you're wasting your time stuff. So I bought some, I sent off to the catalogs for some radio parts and soldered them together and experimented with that, and I bought books on radio, and I was convinced I was going to be an electrical engineer, which I started out doing when I got to college, but I switched majors after the second year into physics. But that's getting a little bit ahead of it, because leaving the farm was a traumatic experience for everybody but me. My brother Mike had been in Korea for 2 years as part of he had been drafted, and I graduated after he had put in 1 year in Korea. So I stayed on the farm for 1 more year, and then my aunt, well, somebody had to do work on the farm. There was, farming had to be done. So once my brother came back, about 2 weeks later, I left. I was helped. My Aunt Esther, the widowed aunt I told you about that lived with us, or maybe that was on the dead camera, and her daughter Marina helped spring me off the farm, and Marina did a great help to get me started in the city. Found me a job at the New Rainbow Cafe at Hennepin Lake, and I signed up for all the courses, and back then you could work your way through college, which I did. And
How much did it cost?
tuition was $80 a quarter. There were 3 quarters in the year. That counted basically everything. That counted lab fees, a subscription to the Minnesota Daily, and also free medical care from the health service, University Health Service. The only thing it didn't cover was books, but the textbooks were about $3 a piece, so that was pretty minor stuff. I did not live on campus. The chef at the Rainbow Cafe owned the building that the restaurant was in, and it's now called the Rainbow House. And he had a sort of storeroom up at the end of a hall, which he let me use for free. And Marina found me a bed, a cot that would fit in there, and so I was in great shape. I had a place to stay. I would take down the chairs in the restaurant in the morning in trade for breakfast, and I'd work there in the evenings, which means I'd get dinner as part of my wages, which, by the way, started out at 72 cents an hour. So I didn't have a lot of income tax to pay, and I was really in good shape.
Describe where you lived.
Well, it was, as I say, the end of a hall. It was painted landlord green, and there was a window facing out on Hennepin Avenue. It's on the third floor. I wanted to go see what's up there, but there's now a security system, so you can't get into the building. It was about 6 feet wide by about perhaps 12 feet long. Had a door at the other end from the window. There was a small closet. There was room for a table and a cot side by side, and that was about it. There was a bathroom that was shared with several others in the hall. And it was kept warm, in fact, over warm, and in the summertime it was unbearably hot because there was, of course, no air conditioning. And Marina bought me a fan, so I was in pretty good shape there, too.
Well, here, tell me about your parents.
Elmer, my father, had, by reports, had been a cheerful youth, but he went into World War I in 1917, 1918, I'm not sure which, 1917, I guess, and was sent over to France, and he came back really dour. He was depressed really all the rest of his life, an extreme pessimist. I think it was because he'd seen a whole lot of people killed for a pointless war, not the last pointless war of the 20th century, but probably the first one. And he, as I said before, he didn't believe it was sort of a demand side economics, that if you don't spend anything, you surely will save money, and that is true. But he had to wait until Social Security kicked in before he could actually make any money to speak of. He was already so used to not spending it that they just bought savings bonds with Social Security. My mother was always a cheerful type. She refused to be brought down by my father's depression, and much of the time ignored him. So I followed her example and ignored him also. I've never regretted ignoring him because I don't think he ever gave me any advice that was worth anything. Or for that matter, I don't know that he ever gave me any advice at all.
Well, did he not object to you going to the university?
He very much objected to me getting an education because everybody knows that's the ruination of youth, is an education. I mean, the Republicans nowadays feel the same way because they don't want to give any money to education. They don't want to ruin the youth. So he was very much ahead of his time in that regards. He was ahead of his time in farming with horses, and he was ahead of his time in being against education.
Well, wasn't it because he thought you'd just start drinking and partying?
He was right. I would start drinking and partying, and that was some of the best part about going to the big city. And however, I couldn't afford to drink and party very much. So it was strictly limited carousing, not the kind of thing that I would have done if I had had more money.
But what did he say to you to express his displeasure in going to the university?
He didn't say anything. Because if he was mad, he just wouldn't talk. So we went several years without him talking to me. But that was okay because I had nothing to say to him and he had nothing to say to me. But then one day he had trouble with a light fixture in the basement. So then he talked to me, he asked me to fix it. And that was the breaking of the ice between us.
How did your parents meet? And
Well, they didn't live that far away from each other. My mother was born on a farm in Fish Lake Township, which is adjacent to Harris Township. And although they went to different grade schools, they probably would have run across each other somewhere. My mother was not my father's first choice. My father was very enamored of some woman named Cleo. And I don't know anything more about her, except that he went into the army and she didn't wait for him. So he was heartbroken, I suppose. He never said anything about it one way or the other. My mother, meanwhile, had moved to Minneapolis because there was no room for women on the farm, basically. She went to the Minnesota School of Business and learned typing and shorthand and bookkeeping, and got a job at the Chamber of Commerce, which was really the grain exchange, where for a grain broker, and she started work in 1921. Excuse me. On the day the stock market, the grain market crashed. That was her first day at work. So everybody was crying, and all the brokers were ruined, and they were running around yelling and screaming, and she was sent up to the next floor to get a broker to sign a piece of paper. And she went upstairs, and they said, well, he's in the washroom. So she waited around for a while, and then finally the police showed up. This guy had gone in the washroom and shot himself. So this was my mother's introduction to the business world. And her attitude was, well, so this is business. I don't know how often my father and mother kept in contact, but he once told of taking the train to visit her. Now the train stopped in Harris. It was a steam engine, a steam locomotive train, and went to St. Paul, and then he would have taken a streetcar over to Minneapolis. But he'd always loved steam engines, so when the train pulled into the depot, he asked the engineer if he could ride in the cab, and the engineer said, sure, if you shovel coal. So my father took off his good jacket and suit jacket and shoveled coal all the way to St. Paul just for the privilege of riding in the locomotive. Then put that suit coat on and went to visit my mother. So she had to have been really desperate in order to marry him, somebody that dumb. Now, when my mother lived in Minneapolis and worked at the grain exchange building, she lived with a family who lived on Minnehaha Parkway, and she babysat for their kid. So there was a long tradition, I guess, of getting put up in some place in return for the labor you do. Which was what happened to me working in the restaurant.
So, when did the marriage proposal happen?
Sometime, well, they got married on December 7th, 1929, which was just 2 months after the entire stock market crashed. So I don't know if they'd had any sense, they probably wouldn't have gotten married, but they did get married anyway, and I'm grateful for that. It's I did not hear any details about what the proposal might have been. Um, no word on that.
Where were they married?
I'm not sure. I assume they were married in the Harris Lutheran Church, but I guess I don't know that for sure.
And at some point, your mother moved back up to Harris.
Yeah, right, and moved in to the family farm.
What was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Swenson, and her parents had emigrated from Sweden, as had my grandparents.
In a different part.
A different part of Sweden, but from Sweden nonetheless.
Tell me about your grandparents' names and, I'm sorry, your mother's name as well.
Okay, it was Ida Swenson, and she was Ida Swenson Jr. because her mother was named Ida also. There's a real paucity of name imagination in the Scandinavian tradition. You're either named Carl or John or Ida or something like that. There are not very many names. Lyle is not in the tradition, and I don't know why I got the name.
So tell me about your grandparents.
Well, my maternal grandfather died long before I was born, so I did not know him at all. He was, forgot his first name, Swenson. My maternal grandmother, I remember as being an old woman. She lived on a farm with two of my uncles, of my mother's brothers, who were bachelors, and she cooked for them. She died in, 1943 or something like that. So I wasn't very old when she died. So I didn't know her very well either. My paternal grandparents, though, C.A. and Augusta Lofgren, they lived only a quarter of a mile away, and we saw them almost every day. He had emigrated from Sweden as a teenager, and he was a really headstrong individual and had not gotten along with his father, who was a blacksmith in Sweden. So he decided to come to America, and he had an uncle who had settled nearby, near the Harris area, which was why he knew that there was such a place as Harris. And but for several years he worked on the railroad in Minneapolis, and then in the area around Willow River, Minnesota, and then in on what was a spur line between Wyoming and Taylor's Falls, Minnesota. By that time he had become quite adept at English and was a section foreman. He had my grandmother was from a fairly poor family that had also emigrated into the Harris area, but again, as women, they were of no use on the farm. So she, as a teenager, went to cook for the section crew at Willow River, which
So
is
they were building the railroad.
They were building the railroad, right? Where they met, and so they got married. I think they got. I don't know where they were when they got married, because, as I say, he was at Willow River, he was at Minneapolis, and he was at Wyoming, or Center City was where they lived. He then had saved up enough money to put a down payment on the farm, because he really didn't care for working for somebody else. And they started farming in the late 1880s and had a bunch of children, had 6 children. It was August and Jenny and Minnie and Esther and Elmer, who was my father, and Paul. Some of them did not last all that, well, all of them lasted long enough to reproduce, but my Uncle August fell out of a chestnut tree while trying to pick nuts, broke his back and died. My Aunt Jenny moved to California where she picked up tuberculosis and died from that. The rest of them lived to be quite old. Okay.
And, but then your grandfather paid off the farm like in a year and a half. It was really very remarkable.
Harris at that time was a potato production center. The land was just the right amount of sandiness for potato production. So there's a tremendous amount of potatoes being grown there, and potatoes were selling for a high price. There were 2 potato warehouses in Harris, and within a couple of years after buying the farm, my grandfather was able to pay off the mortgage. Now, one of the things they did about farming potatoes was they never bothered to fertilize. So after about 10 or 15 years, potatoes would not grow there anymore. And the potato boom was over and the land was pretty well shot. But I mean, we could still grow enough food to feed cattle on. Started growing, when you grow cattle, they produce manure and you spread the manure out on the field, so you have a little bit of organic recycling that did not happen when it was a potato monoculture. On the other hand, spreading manure is not a lot of fun.
Let's hear about some family stories you remember.
Well, there was the one about my uncle falling out of the chestnut tree, which I just told. Excuse me. And he was a very hard person to get along with. He was the oldest, and my grandfather had helped him buy a farm of his own. He had gotten into a fight with my grandmother's brother, Charlie Johnson, that I have no idea what happened in this fight, because the Johnson relatives tell the story completely different from the Lofgren relatives. But they were, one of them could have murdered the other, except that they didn't have the correct tools at hand. One of them, I think Charlie supposedly threw a cat hook, which is a long spear basically that you use for rolling logs, at August, who dodged it, and then hit August he hit Charlie in the nose and gave him a bloody nose. And this was all an argument over right of way on the road. August was always in a hurry, wanted Charlie to pull over. This was on sleds in the wintertime on a country road. He wanted Charlie to pull over so he could go by.
Well, these were horses that were drawn.
They were horse-drawn sleds, yeah. So, at any rate, I have not gotten into any fights with any of my Johnson relatives, but the story is still told, even though everybody involved has been dead for a very long time. The
Went to court.
it went to court because Charlie pressed charges against August, and the judge fined August $10 for assault and battery, and August asked the judge, "If I pay you another $10, can I hit him again?" Now that's one version. That's Brother Mike's version of the story. There are other versions that said that Charlie Johnson was so disliked that other people chipped in to pay the $10 fine. There are the Johnsons, of course, don't agree with either of those versions of the story. The point is that they say that truth is stranger than fiction, but I say truth is indistinguishable from fiction. So, as long as the story is entertaining, that's what counts. It doesn't matter whether it was true or not.
Then there was August got into trouble with his bull.
August got attacked by his bull. We never kept a bull more than 2 years old, which is I think they attain fertility at maybe a year and a half. So we did not keep them very long because an old bull is very unpredictable. Well, August kept bulls for many, many years, kind of as he had a pet, made pets out of them, even though they weighed 2,000 or 3,000 pounds and had horns. He, well, one day he was in the cow yard with the bull, and the bull decided to play with him. And when a bull plays with you, that's usually doesn't have a good outcome. So he got very badly gored by the bull. He wrote a whole long description of what happened, which is on my website. And he got rescued by the hired man. They did have hired men back then when children were too young. First of all, it was the Depression, so labor was cheap. Second of all, most of us were too young to be of much help around the farm. So we had a hired man too, in the form of Bentley, which was his last name, not his first name, which is why I can't speak Swedish very well, because during my language formative years, everybody spoke English around the house because Bentley couldn't speak Swedish.
Where did Bentley live?
Bentley lived in one of the bedrooms. He was an alcoholic, and but you only paid him. We only paid him every 2 weeks, so then he'd disappear for the weekend and come home sick on Monday, ready to work again, and broke. He had originally been born in Michigan, although this didn't come out until after he died. He'd had a home in Michigan and a wife, and he had been in the cavalry, where he had gotten into trouble because he was sick one day, and his captain told him to get on his horse anyway, so he shot the captain, which is not a good idea if you're in the military. But he got only about a year in prison for that at Leavenworth, and when he got out of prison, he was, of course, dishonorably discharged. He went home and found his wife had another man. So he hit the road, and he ended up at our house, a long ways from Michigan, and he had some very esoteric knowledge. He taught me the difference between a millipede and a centipede, for instance, that kind of stuff that you wouldn't have expected a hired man to tell you about. But you learn stuff all over the place.
Tell me more about living at home with your parents, your aunt, and Marina.
Well, Marina wasn't at home when I was, she had already moved to Minneapolis. She had also gone to the business school and had was working at the bank, the Fifth Northwestern National Bank to be exact. So she was very bright, and she did everybody's taxes for them, including the bank president. And
She
so-
kept his checkbook too.
Right. She also kept his checkbook balanced. This is pretty funny for the bank president. But the bank president apparently wasn't very good at arithmetic, no better than me. And at any rate, she made herself very useful to people. And she was certainly useful to me. But she was useful to a lot of other people. She started, when she was going to the business school, Minnesota School of Business, which was located also at Hennepin Lake. A few blocks away was a rug cleaner, a rug merchant named Nish Jamgach. Nish Jamgach was an Armenian, and he looked. I saw him in his old age because he would come into the restaurant every morning for breakfast. He did not look at all like he belonged in Minnesota. He didn't look like a Swede at all. But Marina lived in this house that was a rug merchant's house, and also cleaned carpeting for Nish Jamgach. Somebody would bring in an oriental carpet to be cleaned. She'd clean it. I forget what his advertising was, but that this was the implication was that he brought somebody over from the Middle East who was an expert in carpet cleaning.
I thought it was carpet mending.
Carpet mending, that's right. Well, it was cleaning and mending, that's right. Carpet mending, yeah, an expert mender. I don't know if he made up a name for her or what, but nobody knew it was just Marina in the back room mending these carpets. And it was because she was working for Nish Jamgach, she would also bring the money to the bank and do the books for Jamgach, which is how she impressed the bank president who hired her away from Jamgach. But the point is that there was something about the people who went to Minneapolis, which was the only place you'd go. You'd never think of going to New York. Minneapolis was the city. The people who escaped the farm were very bright, very able to fend for themselves, and they were not helpless types at all, and they were opportunistic. Marina was opportunistic, I was opportunistic. Something came along, you grabbed it, because you knew that if you failed, you had to go back to that damn farm with nothing to look forward to.
What was your relationship to Esther?
She read to me when I was very little. I don't remember learning to read. I mean, I'd sit in her lap and she'd read books to me.
And she named you.
She named me also, so that was a big relationship. I think I was named after somebody named Lyle Griggs, who I never met, and I have no idea who it was. But I guess she thought it was a nice name.
But there were two choices of names that had come up, and one of them was Harold.
Right. Harold was the other choice because my mother had a brother who died of diphtheria when he was about 12 years old. He was named Harold, and my sentimental mother wanted to name me after that. But as Liz has pointed out, we would have never gotten married if that were the case, since that was her father's name. And we never would have even gotten within 80 feet of each other if she found out what my name really was.
All right, we're on the air. So when did you Well, I guess talk about when you both got interested, or how you got interested in folk music.
Well, I was interested in it. I mean, I was exposed to it when I was in New York City going to elementary school, a private progressive school called City and Country School. And our music teacher had put together a songbook that included things like the Boll Weevil song, and they were, folksy anyway, kind of songs. And I also knew about Pete Seeger, who used to quite often do concerts at the Little Red Schoolhouse, and I remember, jealous because he didn't come to our school. But I was very aware of him at that time, and that would have been in the 40s. And so I always was being exposed, and then when I went to boarding schools in the Berkshires, we also did, things like Michael Rowe, the Boat Ashore, and I Got a Hammer, and Weaver songs, that sort of thing, Goodnight Irene. So I was aware we all just sang and played together for fun. I mean, I didn't play an instrument at that time. And then I moved to Oregon, and I went to Reed College, and we had Pete Seeger, and Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee came out and gave a concert. And so I was reintroduced to Pete, and I got kind of interested in. A few years later, I bought a banjo, and I took some banjo lessons from a friend, actually for maybe only one night. I stayed all night and at a party and learned to do the basic strum. And I got Pete Seeger's little book, How to Play the 5-String Banjo. And then I heard the Folkways Anthology, a wonderful 3-record compendium put together by Harry Smith of old recordings, very strange old recordings by artists who had been recorded back in the 20s and 30s, both black and white. And I was so inspired by that, I became then much more interested. And that was about the time that I moved to Minneapolis. And when I got to Minneapolis, first thing they did was form the Folk Song Society of Minnesota. And at that time it was pretty easy to meet people, so somehow or another we found people of similar interests that would come over to our apartment on Friday nights and play, some of them pretty much all night. And I met Lyle through the music. I went to a concert put on at the Unitarian Society of Local Talent, and Lyle was one of the people playing that night. And he did Little Birdie.
No.
No,
I
he
did do a little birdie, yeah, but it was the assassination of Mr. Garfield that really
Well, I was
got
going to bring up that, yeah. And I knew that that particular song was only available on one record, so that this had to be somebody that was pretty interested in the music to have that particular record. And so after the concert, I introduced myself to him, and I invited him over to the apartment to hear my collection, because at that time I'd already met Uncle Willie, who was a person that lived with his mother and didn't come out much, but was very interested in the music, having learned it in the South Pacific when he was in the Seabees, and had met a couple of Southerners who sang this kind of music, and he'd fallen in love with it, and he'd begun to collect it. So he had this incredible record collection, all 78s, which he bought from auctions. There were auctions that with printed catalogs, and he would bid on records, and also had bought field recordings from the Library of Congress. And so he had a marvelous collection, which in the turned out, as it got disseminated, that all kinds of people that we meet were introduced to some of this music by Willie's collection being taped and retaped and retaped and passed around the country. Anyway, so I had Lyle come over, and he he was interested in his collection and wanted to listen to it. So that's how I met him.
But I had been doing stuff with music before that. As I had said earlier, I tried my hand at piano when I was young, but I wasn't any good at it. My father and brother Mike played fiddle, as did my uncle Sixten. So I heard a lot of fiddle playing music when I was a kid, but I couldn't handle I was physically clumsy and I couldn't learn. I tried to learn fiddle, but I wasn't able to. Could make no sense out of it. But I still listened to music a lot and continued to listen to music a lot after I came to Minneapolis. I roomed for one summer with with an acquaintance named John Clayson, who, this was after I was in graduate school, no longer living in that corner of the closet. And he invited me along to a Pete Seeger concert at the Unitarian Society. So I thought that was really great. What Pete got across most of all was that anybody can play and sing this stuff. Maybe you can't do it very well, but you can do it. And so I was inspired. I went out and bought a cheap, a $35 Stella guitar. It was $35 new, made out of plywood, and it was terrible to play. But I at least learned some chords, and so I could sing along with it. And then as I had an assistantship in graduate school, so I was in the money basically. I was getting $200 a month, and so I bought a banjo and took one of the fiddles from home, it was a really bad one, and started practicing on the instruments. Learned banjo and then fiddle, and I had to independently run across the Folkways Anthology of American Folk Music from Liz. Got very interested in that music and the music of the New Lost City Ramblers. I started playing with John's younger brother Bud, who plays guitar and sings tenor, and we started working up some pieces. I also got a part-time work teaching guitar at a music store, even though I didn't know anything about it. But the people who were learning it knew even less, so I was a teacher. And it was out of that music store that a bunch of us got together and put on this concert at the Unitarian Society, and Liz already told you the rest of the story. So that's about it. We've been playing the music ever since for over 50 years, 55 years probably, and not gotten tired of it yet.
Well, you should mention the band that formed as a result of the Friday night party.
The band was Uncle Willie and the Brandy Snifters. It consisted of Willard Johnson, who was Uncle Willie, and me and Bud Clayson on guitar. I played fiddle usually. Picked up some more people shortly after we formed. John Pancake, who also played fiddle, and Marcia Pancake, who played guitar. And when Uncle Willie got too old to play, Liz took over the banjo duties, and we put out some CDs, homemade CDs of our handiwork.
How did you come up with the name?
It was at a party at Liz's place, and somebody had brought some brandy, so there were some brandy snifters on the table, and there was a so-called talent contest at a local tavern called the Padded Cell, so we decided to enter it, and we needed a name, so we called them Uncle Willie and the Brandy Snifters. As it turned out, on the day we were to perform, Uncle Willie was sick, so it was just Bud and I as the Brandy Snifters. And we lost out to Tony Glover and a guy named Noel Johnson, who did blues. The interesting thing about it is that Tony was the judge, and he was right. He was better than us. I mean, so he was an impartial judge, even though he picked himself as the winner.
So tell us the name of the song and a little bit about where you learned it in the first song you're
The
going to
first
play.
song called "Oh My Little Darling," and it's from a recording that was a field recording that was deposited in the Library of Congress. Can't remember who first recorded it. It's what's sometimes called a banjo song or a lyric song. It has verses that don't tell a story at all. They just there to I don't know what the words express, but it's a fun song to play and sing. So, are we ready to do that?
Absolutely.
Little darling, don't you weep and mourn. Some sweet day I'm coming, take my baby home. Oh, my little darling, don't you weep and cry. Some sweet day I'm coming to marry you or die. And down the railroad, cross the county line. Pretty little girls are plenty, but a wife is hard to find. Down the railroad, cross the county line. Pretty little girls are plenty, a wife is hard to find. Jimmy drives a wagon, Jimmy walks behind. Kill yourself laughing, see them horses fly. Sorry, I got mixed up on the count there. It's very hard to play music and count at the same time.
Sure.
I don't know how blues people do it at all. But there's supposed to be two low parts and one high part. And if a person were playing by themselves, of course, it wouldn't matter. But when it's two people, it's a little more difficult.
Yeah, you fooled me there.
I did. But fortunately, this wasn't being recorded.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Okay.
So, do you have another song for us?
I don't know.
Well, we don't know. Why don't you shut the machine off while
Okay.
we figure that out? Anyway, well then we should pick a good tune.
No, you play what you want. Play that one again, play a new one.
Well, let's play it again. It's on
Wait,
my
I
phone.
want to see. Wait a minute. I should slide.
I use my little finger.
I don't know. I might not get there.
Not that. There it is.
Yep.
You want to try it or not?
I don't know. I don't do it very well.
It sounded good to me.
Remember about what Pete Seeger said, you don't have to do it well, all you have to do is do it.
Okay.
Thank you.
also in D. Okay, let's try that for real.
We're on.
Oh, we're already on? You've been recording the whole thing?
What the heck? I can edit it out.
Oh, okay, well then there's no point in doing it anymore, I guess.
Want to do it some more, Mark, or no?
Or if you want to have another one, that's fine. Anything will do.
That was
That
a
wasn't a
Tell me about that. Yeah,
That
tell
was
me.
a Swedish song called the Gardaby walking tune, and a walking tune was they would have, if you were going from one village to another, particularly for something like a marriage, this was maybe a 3 or 4 mile walk. The fiddlers would lead the way, playing a melody all the way, while the rest of the town walked behind them. And this was just a ceremonial sort of thing. I don't think they do it anymore, but that was, so this is a good tune to walk to. One that, if it's played right, and towards the end we were getting it pretty good, I would say. Gardaby is a town in Dalarna, and Dalarna is a province sort of in the middle of Sweden. All the different provinces, or landskaps as they're called, have different tunes. So there's very little tune communication between the different areas. I never heard this when I was a kid, for example. The music that came over to America was not at all the same as the music that was in Sweden. Some of the pieces, actually what happened is what's called the island effect. There were tunes that were popular in the 1800s. They came over here and they stayed, whereas the Swedes learned up new tunes, and the immigrants were still playing the old tunes. Okay, that's
Is there any other?
nothing that we
Swedish.
practiced in a very long time.
No,
Did you want to try Evening Shade?
no, it's too hard.
Too hard? Well, all right.
I mean, I can try it.
I remember the song I grew up on, which was the Cuckoo. I know you can't probably sing that
No,
anymore,
I can't sing.
right? But do you play it still? Nope.
I haven't played it for a long time.
Why don't you try a little Evening Shade?
Let's see, how does it go?
It's in G.